and eventually around India to the port of Calcutta. Here, late in February, he boarded an American Army Air Corps plane that ferried him high across the glaciers and peaks of the Himalayas and into the heartland of China. Now he had arrived in its capital, or at least the capital of the part of the country that was still free of the Japanese invaders, and he was eager to begin his work. Joseph Needham's mission was of sufficient importance to the British government to warrant his having an armed escort. The passenger with him on the aircraft was a man named Pratt, a king's messenger who had been charged by London with making absolutely certain that Needham reached his final destination, His Britannic Majesty's embassy to the Republic of China, safe and sound. The pair began their climb up into the city. They first walked across a rickety pontoon bridge that floated on boats anchored in the fast-flowing Yangtze. They were followed by the embassy driver and a small squad of banban men, the well-muscled porters who had slung Needham's innumerable pieces of baggage onto the thick bamboo poles they held yoked across their shoulders. The small group then began to clamber up the steps, nearly 500 of them, the lower few rows of massive, foot-high granite sets muddy and slimy with the daily rise and fall of the river, the upper ones hot and dusty and alive with hawkers and beggars and confidence men eager to trick any newcomers panting up from the riverside. By the time they reached the top, and the lowermost of Chongqing's ziggurat of streets, Needham was perspiring heavily. It was well over 95 degrees that afternoon, and the humidity was as high as in Mississippi in July. People had warned him that Chongqing was one of the country's 3 great furnaces, but he knew more or less what to expect. The man who is selected to come to China, his letter of appointment had stated, must be ready for anything. The driver unlocked his jeep and began loading Needham's gear. King's messenger Pratt, his duty now complete, shook Needham by the hand, remarking gruffly that he hoped Needham would be happy in China, and that it had been a privilege to have escorted so remarkable a man. He saluted and scurried off down a side street where a car was waiting for him. Needham took a cigarette from a case in his shirt pocket, lit it, inhaled deeply, and gazed down to the river below. The scene was mesmerizing. Sailing junks, salt barges and sampans made their way languidly across the immense stream, while armed patrol vessels and navy tenders pushed more urgently against the current, bent on more pressing business. The aircraft on which he had arrived took off with a roar, rose quickly and turned away, diminishing into a speck above the mountains that ringed the city. Everything that he could see and hear as he leaned over the terrace, the boom of a siren from a passing cargo ship, the constant jangle of rickshaw bells in the streets beside him, the ceaseless barrage of cries and shouted arguments from within the tenements that rose about him, and then the smells of incense smoke, car exhaust, hot cooking oil, a particularly acrid kind of pepper, human waste, oleander, jasmine, all served to remind him of one awesome, overwhelming reality, that he was at last here in the middle of the China that he had dreamed of for so long. It was all terrifyingly different from the world he already knew. Just a few months before, he had been comfortably harboured in the quiet of his life at Cambridge University, his days spent either working at his bench in his laboratory or studying in his small suite of rooms in the heart of a 14th-century college. The world he knew there was a place of English flower gardens, new-mown lawns, ivy-covered courtyards, an ancient chapel, a library that smelled of leather and beeswax, and, rising from the city beyond its walls, the gentle sounds of the amiably disagreeing clocks chiming the hours and the quarters. It was a haven of civilized peace and academic seclusion, of privilege and exclusivity. And now he'd been transported to this ruined city, wrecked by years of war, a place still jittery and confused. He sat in the front seat of the jeep as his driver set off for the half-hour drive to the embassy. It was by now late in the afternoon. The sun was setting through the brown, smoky skies behind the hills, and lanterns were being lit in the darker streets as they passed. On all sides were ruined or destroyed buildings. The Japanese bombers had hit Chongqing more than 200 times in the past 3 years. Very few buildings were whole and unscathed, and tens of thousands of people still lived in caves that were used as bomb shelters. Needham could see the entrance holes in the cliffs beside the road, and outside their inhabitants clustered like wasps. The narrow streets were fizzing with lanterns, jammed with stalls, and crowded with tides of humanity, a jostling, seething mass who seemed to be occupied mostly with eating, spitting, squatting.